Western Digital is a company that's in the technology sector that is very advanced in analytics. They bought SanDisk, they went SanDisk. They're good at inventory. And I hear from transportation from Western Digital. And for Dollar General, I just love what Tony's done around re-architecting Dollar General and being able to look at reliability and shelves and redefining the business, the dollar contract. When I needed toilet paper in the recession, the only place I could get it was Dollar General. It was the most reliable system, and I think that one of the issues that we have is when we look at Laura's list of supply chains to admire, of Dollar General, Sleep Number, Western Digital, Packer, TSMC, these are not the normal companies we associate with supply chain leadership. What we have going on is really an engine where everyone gets on stage and they talk about their story, but we never ask the question of, are they driving business results? Are they beating the curves? And what we do in the supply chains to admire is we do the industry chart and then we say, is this company beating their industry? Are they beating their industry sector and why? And what we're building are really the case studies of the people that have built the industry sector. So with that, I'm going to ask Peter to come to the stage. Peter and I have known each other for more years than we'd like to talk about. And Peter is really a leader at ASCM, which used to be Apex. Have a seat, Peter. We're going to chat about why things are the way they are. So what do you think of the methodology of the supply chains to admire?
Well, I've followed it for a lot of years, right? So I'm a big fan of orbit charts. Have been for a long time.
And the supply chain index, your thoughts about that for improvement?
So again, if I were to step back, so for those of you, we served on the Supply Chain Council board, in the early 2000s. So I was part of the SCORE 1.0 build. So I've seen from a street view about 150 SCORE projects over time. And so, you can look at the strategic focus areas that everybody, really focuses on. But the one thing that separates, and I think you've proven it with data, what is the difference between industry benchmarking and the orbit chart is, I think the supply chains to admire have figured out how to tightly weave business strategy with supply chain strategy. If you were to go into these companies and say, hey, how do you separate the two? You can't. And I think a lot of people, to your earlier point on form and function, you have a supply chain strategy that is sometimes independent of the business strategy. So,
and why do you think that is?
Oh gosh, well, that would be a good question for those supply chains to admire to ask. But I would say, for all of you that have ever participated in an S&OP journey, right? And I'll use one that I participated in for about 12 years. You go through these ebbs and flows of, I'm now excellent, I lose some key people, and suddenly the leadership changes and the importance of that process is what's key. And I think a lot of that has to do with how tightly woven the supply chain performance is to actually want to go and win business. And I think the supply chains to admire are based on being able to pair things that seem opposite. That they've figured out that secret sauce, and it sticks over time.
This concept of the complex nonlinear supply chain and the fact that we invested in really transactional systems and the world became more variable. Why do you think we started to lose resiliencies in these industry sectors about 2014?
So I don't know I have the answer, but I have three things, right? So I think one of the layers of planning, and I was talking to some of the folks yesterday about this, was we from a shareholder standpoint continued this corporate development exercise where we're acquiring things, and we're divesting of things over time. And so I may have improved my finished good turns on this thing, but I've now inherited crap that I need to fix, right? And so you have this corporate development activity independent, so business strategy independent of supply chain, and supply chain is constantly having to fix stuff that I just bought or acquired. I think that's one. The other thing is, and we talked about this one, is even today, most, I'm going to call it average companies are using 30% of the functionality they bought 5 years ago.
And 68% depend on Excel spreadsheets, right?
I would say it's higher than that, but yes.
And we can't do this modeling in an Excel spreadsheet.
It's too complex, which I'm looking forward to the outside-in planning discussion tomorrow. I think the third thing is this idea around business strategy. I think fundamentally, if you were to go back to most folks who have figured out the magic of how to tight weave that, and that comes from the CEO. And so when you think about CEOs that have figured out how to make sure that product development is aligned with marketing, is aligned with sales, is aligned with, operations and supply chain, and together, people make decisions around how do we, grow profitably.
So Peter, I want to tell our food and beverage story.
Do it.
We were both working together at a food and beverage company that will be nameless. And there was a wonderful woman who was a great supply chain leader that you were working with. And talk a little bit about the use of the SCORE model and the work you did at food and beverage company.
Tomorrow I have a chart track over a 12-year period of time. It's probably the only longitudinal study you're going to see on that one. We kept track of people who, at a corporate level, use SCORE to come up with portfolios of improvement, typically by business unit. And so we have these 12 areas, and I think this person, this unique individual, had an amazing history of the company, understood kind of cross-functional, so products, manufacturing, R&D. So it was a unique skill set inherent in this person. And so while that person was in charge, they made great strides in their supply chain, but the person reported to a chief operating officer who was very much manufacturing, I'm going to say OEE, right? And so as the person left, I think you see the performance changing based on that one. So.
And this company had a very heavy-handed CFO that went through a lot of really transactional supply chain financial reengineering, offshoring, buying procurement, and the combination of the chief operating officer who only understood manufacturing and this financial reengineering just totally overlaid all the good work you were doing, in my opinion.
So, and I think that goes back to all of you. I mean, you have leadership organizations that influence supply chain that. And so again, the secret sauce that we need to learn from these supply chains to admire is how do you weave that so tight that you can't unravel it? And I think that's a lesson that we're all looking to see you write about in the future, Laura. So,
and I think the digital capabilities with the simulation and the ability to be able to show executive teams this thing called the complex nonlinear system, because it was just so sad to see that unravel. It's really was incredible work, right? And they just totally went backwards. And in 2011, they would have qualified for the supply chains to admire.
Exactly.
But over the last decade, they got. And that's like a lot of people that are struggling with this heavy-handed CFO or COO that only understands manufacturing, or a manufacturing function that only wants to serve manufacturing, or a procurement function that only wants to serve procurement. So what advice do you have?
Gosh. So I think the advice that I would have is how do you work towards ensuring sustained leadership, as part of the C-suite? Again, at the end of the day, having a peer-to-peer voice on how do we tightly weave strategy, will yield the right investments, in manufacturing flexibility, will yield the right investments in IT, digital capabilities that you want to double down on. It will focus on the right inventory goals. It will integrate product lifecycle management, which, again, all of us have been trying to work towards. So I think the biggest single piece of advice I have, and again, nobody in here can dictate that, right? CEOs and their teams have to work towards that one. But the question is how do you influence that to happen over time?
So I think the ability to do, simulation on, this digital twin offers promise. The ability to show the benchmarks and the industry sectors and to change the discussion, to be able to question what we've been doing, I think is really important. But I think it requires a whole level of education, right, which I really look forward to partnering with you on, right, because we really want to write the stories of the supply chains to admire and really bring that home so that we can kind of change the world. So any last thoughts here?
My last thought is you can't avoid the truth, right? So again, you're faced with, again, in the disruption, you can't ignore the truth. But the question is how do you kind of map the path? And there's plenty of other folks that have left breadcrumbs for us to learn from. So I go back to leadership and learning are two really important aspects. And then the last thing that Jane mentioned during her session was do not underestimate the impact of really good change management. You enter an idea and it works, right? You thought big and you acted small, but, change behaviors. Again, that's not something to be taken for granted.
So I'll tell a story, and I'd like your perspective. I worked with a beverage company, small beverage company, brilliant CEO who was very lean and pushed all the inventory to the distributors, had great relationships with the distributors. And he hired a CFO from a food manufacturer that said, no, that's not the way we did it. We need large distribution centers. We need to really go with, our traditional technologies, pulled all the inventory, stopped looking at channel data, and they fell out of the supply chains to admire, right? And so when I went back, the CFO was not really open for the discussion, right? And I think that's the issue that many people face here.
Agreed.
Yeah, so that's what we're all about. Is how do we change the world and train people?
Educate.
Educate. Thank you, Peter.
Yep.
So now we're going to hear from Western Digital. And this is Western Digital's orbit chart. And so when we look at these orbit charts, we're looking at how to do. So you can see 2011, moving forward, they're driving improvement in margin, and then they start to have some squiggle lines as they move on inventory. 2018 is a better year, and then 2019, 2020. So you might say, well, that company is not very resilient, and I would agree with you. However, look at the average over those years versus the industry. And that's what we're really looking at is, are companies better at the industry sector over those years? Now, inside Western Digital, they did a lot of acquisitions. They did a lot of change in focus. This is an industry with a lot of change. And this is their overall scores against the industry sector, and it's probably too small for you to read, but I would encourage you to read the Supply Chains to Admire reports and look at all the data. So we're going to have a video now from Matthew Smith, and Matthew couldn't make it because of COVID, but he's going to tell the story of Western Digital, and then when we get done, I'm going to bring Sleep Number to the stage, and we're going to learn a little bit more about Sleep Number. So let's push Matthew.